Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, a podcast devoted to exploring perspectives on sustainable development by young professionals working in the field. Sense and Sustainability is a collaborative effort with Consilience, the Journal of Sustainable Development at Columbia University. I'm your host, Ji-Sung Park, of the University of Oxford. Our email address is sense.sustainability@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts about today's show, in addition to any suggestions you might have regarding ideas for future episodes. And as always, thanks for tuning in. My guest today is Shahid Naeem. Professor Shahid Naeem is Professor of Ecology in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology at Columbia University, where he is currently the chair of the department. Before coming to Columbia, Professor Naeem was a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, and among a long list of accolades, he is the recipient of the Lenfest Prize for Distinguished Faculty, as well as the Mercer Award for Best Ecological Paper by a Young Ecologist. Professor Naeem, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Professor Naeem and I will be talking about a series of issues related to biodiversity, particularly in terms of how we might value biodiversity and maybe some of the reasons why it might be important and also some of the reasons why it might be difficult to do so. But before we go down that road, let's start with your personal story, Professor. Not to make you comb too far through your memory, but tell us a little bit about how you first got involved in the field of ecology and what it was that drew you in.
Well, I think like most people, especially myself growing up in a city like Brooklyn, the idea of nature was something about what you'd read in National Geographic at the dentist's office, or you see occasionally on television, or maybe at the zoo or something like that, or a park.
Right.
But when I entered undergraduate school and started working on biology, I became increasingly attracted to the biology of whole organisms. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until graduate school that I actually became attracted to the idea that all these organisms that I was studying individually interact with one another at different scales and form what we call the fabric of life.
Right.
And I actually think it wasn't until I just about graduated with my PhD that it all sort of sunk in that every species I was looking at was part of a very large system that made our planet the habitable and safe place we know and love. And so I've turned my attention completely to that since the 1980s, and that's been the focus of my research and my teaching and my writing.
Great. Did you have any particular mentors that stand out in your mind that kind of guided you in that, or did it kind of come about organically?
Well, it's a bit of both, I suppose, in terms of there was a mentor, but then there was also serendipity involved.
Right.
In that I happened to take a job looking for research experience with somebody who was an ecologist, but I was a cell biology major, planning to go to medical school, much as most children's parents want them to do. And
sure. And this is an undergrad, right?
Really enjoyed being in the lab and the sort of questions that he asked. Mm-hmm. And he just happened to get a grant at the time that would fund him for 3 years to work in places like Dominica and Puerto Rico and Mexico and Southern California and many places in the Caribbean. And he said, would I like to be his full-time technician? And I said yes. His name is Robert Caldwell. And I think my travels with him to the rainforests and the jungles of the New World really opened up my eyes to studying biology as a very large, complex system as opposed to studying cells and molecular processes, which is what I did when I thought I was going to go to medical school.
Sure. So this is a bit of a digression, but what you just said kind of reminded me. I don't know if you've read any of, I'm sure you've read some of E.O. Wilson's work.
Certainly.
He has a new, I guess you can call it semi-autobiographical fiction called Anthill. I don't know if you've read that.
It's actually sitting right to the right of me on my desk here.
No kidding.
It was given to me as a Christmas present, so you see I haven't gotten to it yet.
Well, it's an amazing read. It's got everything. It's got adventure, drama, social commentary, some pretty serious ecology, everything. But anyway, it reminds me of sort of a scene in there where I guess the semi-autobiographical character of E.O. Wilson kind of finds that passion by almost by serendipity, but also right with a mentor that sees the potential there. Anyway, great.
Well, I was at a meeting where he was picking up an award not too long ago from the New York Academy of Sciences. And I was invited to the celebration of that award. And he mentioned that he felt that he had written scholarly works for scientists and he had written sort of popular works for the educated or interested audiences in the problem of biodiversity. Mm-hmm. But then he realized that there was a whole other audience which only reads novels, and so he had to write a novel. And so he added that to his list of publications.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I've always been a huge fan of E.O. Wilson, but when he came out with the novel, my first reaction was, oh, really? That's interesting. I wonder how this will turn out. Not to say I was skeptical, but, it's not something you'd expect. But then, yeah, I'll let you decide once you read it, but I thought it was amazing.
Well, I think skeptical is the right reaction because most scientists, in fact, the vast majority of them, don't write fiction.
True.
And to have one who's as prominent a scholar as himself to write a novel is certainly breaking with tradition.
Yeah. So I'd like to change gears a bit and move towards talking about your research and more generally the issue of biodiversity. Now, I know this may be contentious, especially within the E3B department, but for the sake of providing as democratic a starting point for analysis as possible, if you don't mind, Professor, let's start from a anthropocentric perspective, right? Let's say we can only legitimately care about human welfare for now. I'd love to get into what you think about the welfare of animals and other living creatures, either from an intrinsic value perspective or even an animal rights perspective if we have time. But again, in the interest of framing the issue as conservatively and as a policy-relevant way as possible, let's go with this for now. Say policymakers only care about human welfare. In that case, in what ways is biodiversity valuable to us?
Well, I think that actually the two are inseparable,
sure.
Human welfare and biological diversity. Now, one thing that's important to clarify is that when scientists use the term biological diversity, they mean the diversity of life on Earth, not just the number of species. So we're talking about a habitat having a mixture of grasslands and deserts and rainforests, as well as having lots of species of animals and microorganisms and so forth, and plants. So we see all aspects of diversity, whether it's genetic diversity, species diversity, ecological diversity, ecosystem diversity, as being captured by that one term, biological diversity. Most people, I think, when they use the word biodiversity, just think it's the number of species. And from that perspective, it is very hard to defend biological diversity as just the number of species to say that it's important to human well-being. Because you could argue if it's just the number of species, we could, say, raise billions of dollars and build a gigantic zoo/greenhouse like the Eden Project or Biosphere 2 or some of the great zoos and botanical gardens we have around the world, make sure that every single species is in there, then wash our hands and say, well, we've done our job, we've saved biological diversity.
Right, sort of the Noah's Ark approach.
What really matters is not the species that live in those contained environments, but actually the natural world around us. And when you consider that the fertility of our soils, the productivity of our ecosystems, the potability of our water, the breathability of our air is all driven by natural systems, then it seems hard to separate human well-being from biological diversity in its true and broad sense from its more narrow sense as the number of species. And I think when you consider that out of the 6 billion people that are in the world, that some of us may be wealthy enough and live in wealthy nations that if it gets hot, we can turn on air conditioning. If we catch a disease, we can hope there's a cure for it or afford the medical treatment to take care of ourselves. And if crops fails, we can get up enough money to buy food from someplace, even if we have to deprive others. But when you realize that 2 billion of the people in the world actually live on less than $1.25 a day, and 1 billion people are hungry, and that 3 billion people, or almost half of today's 6.8 billion people, are living in water-scarce environments, they live very close to their natural environment. So again, what do you mean by human welfare? Do you mean globally and the well-being of all of our people? Then I would say half the population of the world is critically dependent on biological diversity, but in that broad sense.
Right. And I feel like you bring up an interesting distinction that most of, say, us in the developed world the 1 billion or so who have a high per capita income, almost have a divorced sense of reality when it comes to what biodiversity even means. Like you said, we can only really think of it in terms of species, or like you said earlier about National Geographic, whereas for most of the population it's more of a day to day. But getting back to the issue of what we're measuring, if we're not talking about biodiversity in terms of species, and I agree with you that there seems to be good reason why we shouldn't necessarily do that, what other unit of measure can we or should we focus on?
Well, within my discipline, my colleagues and I are focusing more and more on what's called functional diversity rather than taxonomic diversity. So taxonomic diversity concerns all of those species and genera and families and so forth that people like to make sure they have really nice collections in zoos, museums, and gardens or aquaria. But when you get down to functional diversity, that's something that is really the aspect of biological diversity or biodiversity that tells you about how it's related to human well-being. So functional diversity doesn't concern so much what a species' name is, but concerns where it's found and what it does. So this is like if a person comes to you and say, I don't really care what your name is, just tell me what your job is.
Okay.
And if you say that you're a banker, or you're an engineer, or you're a medical professional, that immediately allows us to understand what role the species plays. Unfortunately, most of our information is about taxonomic diversity. We have a very good understanding of what the names of many species are, although there are many that have not been cataloged yet.
Right.
There's a big push to catalog them all, and I think we can do it in a few years. But if you have just the name, and you have the evolutionary relationships, like who's related to whom over evolutionary time, that doesn't really tell you what their job is in nature. And if you're thinking about trying to value species or trying to look at it from an economic perspective, I think if you think of human society, certainly knowing what role people play in their community or in their society is very important for evaluation.
Absolutely.
When you're looking at species, you have to ask the same question, what job do you play? And we can actually tell a lot about what the job of the species is by its morphology, by its physiology, where it's located, how fast it reproduces, and so forth. Unfortunately, we have a lot of catching up to do because these communities where they live are changing so fast. I wonder if we can figure out what their jobs are before they disappear.
That's interesting. I've actually never heard it phrased like that, but that makes so much sense. And particularly from an economics angle, that makes even more sense. I mean, why do we care about the names more than the jobs? That's interesting.
Well, you can see one place where it's really playing out quite strongly in terms of what species actually do is because of the concern that many people have, most of the world has, about climate change.
Right.
And climate change is interesting because it's actually forced people to look at carbon, and the carbon cycle is a biological process as well as an industrial process. And we now recognize that if you want to deal with the carbon cycle, like trying to find ways to store carbon in forests or in soil or even in the ocean, or what the impacts of carbon might be on things like coral reefs if it leads to acidification of the ocean, they're actually looking at what species do in terms of their roles in the carbon cycle. But of course, species have more roles than that. They have roles in the sulfur cycle, in the nitrogen cycle. They have roles in terms of how they determine the actual structure of habitats, the physical structure as well. And now that we've started cataloging the jobs that species play in terms of cycling carbon and storing carbon, because we're interested about how it impacts climate change and human well-being, if we could go further and say, well, what are their roles in nitrogen? What are their roles in degrading pollutants? What are their roles in purifying water? We could add to what we already know about carbon to find out more about what communities the species play. And carbon actually is readily connected to economies because it relates to energy, it relates to industry. We know the value of carbon. We can even put a price on it. For some of these other functions that species play, because we've been so used to getting their work for free, we haven't actually done our homework to figure out what it is. And, I've often described it as we have some, 1 trillion tons of species made up of perhaps 30 million different kinds of species, all working for us day and night, 24/7, all around the world, everywhere you can look. And they've never sent us a bill for their services.
No, they haven't.
And yet they provide us with all these services, which we are really quite